So we are recording, and again, I just want to thank Maggie, and I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Mac, David, Amy, and Kathleen for joining Maggie. I think that's everybody. Did I get everybody? Yeah, I think that's the panelists. So we are recording, and if folks have, I'm looking at the list, and I'm pretty sure everybody who was on this list has been to a ULVLC session before, but if you haven't, or if you want a refresher, please know that you can always use the chat. So especially since we have multiple panelists today, I think chat's probably going to be the best way to ask questions during the presentation. There may be times, and there probably will be times that you can unmute yourself and speak to the group with questions that you might have. But if you have questions related to content, or if you have like tech issues, please feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on that so that our presenters don't have to. And with that being said, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Maggie. I'm assuming Maggie will be getting us started this morning.
Yeah.
So take it away, Maggie.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I thought about this session in relation to the deadline on Friday for ACRL 2021. But I also think that it is useful for anyone who will be thinking about writing a conference proposal in the next, X number of months. Because I was thinking specifically of ACRL, I thought it would be useful to have some information about that up front and then get into the questions for the panelists, which deal with their tips, tricks, and experiences with conference proposals for all conferences that they have worked with or proposed to or been a part of. Some quick notes about ACRL proposals. If you're thinking of submitting something for the Friday deadline, it's only these first 4 session formats. So everything else, lightning talks, posters, roundtables, tech connects, webcasts, those aren't due until October. And the ACRL organizers have said that people who submit for the May 8th deadline should receive notification in August, which should give you plenty of time to rethink and repackage your proposal for the October 9th deadline if you want to try to reformat that. And then they also had a webcast, which is recorded on YouTube via that link at the bottom with ACRL specific tips. Tech Connect, Suzanne, is a format where you demonstrate some kind of technology tip. I think is pretty similar to a lightning talk, maybe a little longer. But it's a technology demonstration, they've said, and there's information on their call for, what do they call it, participation page. So here are some ACRL specific tips. They really recommend that you read through the requirements for each session format because one of the things that will get a low score by reviewers is if the proposal doesn't really address the requirements of the format itself. They also suggest, and this I think is true of all conference proposals where you have to submit it through some kind of submission system or especially a Google form, is don't write it in the submission system or form itself, but instead copy and paste it from Word or Google Docs, or write it by hand in your journal and then transcribe it in, whatever you want to do, but just so that you don't lose all of your work should something happen. Really important for ACRL, they say don't include any identifying information in your proposal, not your name, not your institution, but they said also to avoid even URLs or links to pages. So the URL part is like your institution don't use a go.uncg.edu link to something because they said that's enough identifying information to disqualify your proposal, but also links to pages where you are identified. And then your session learning outcomes should be simple and achievable. So they really look to make sure that your learning outcomes are aligned to the session format and also the amount of time and what is reasonable to what can be achieved. So don't write really lofty learning outcomes that are not going to be able to be achieved in the time and format that you have. Okay, so moving away from ACRL specifically, I thought it would be fun to hear from some of our colleagues in different departments with their tips and tricks on proposal writing. So today, like Jenny said, I'm about to sneeze, by the way, we are joined by Amy Harris-Hauk, who is the head of ROI. Sorry, David Gwynn, who's the digitization coordinator, Kathleen McCarty-Smith, who is the interim head of SCUA and outreach archivist, and Mac Nelson, a cello music cataloger. Thank you, Sarah Dorsey. Okay, so I have some questions prepared. Think of these as just general prompts also, panelists. Like if there's something you want to say that doesn't answer the question but is related to the topic of the question, please go ahead and go in that direction. And then at the end, we'll take questions for the panelists from the audience. And again, you can do that in chat, or maybe by the end, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask questions live, depending on how many people have questions. And maybe I can call on people with the raise your hand function, which we've used before in a ULVLC session, at least one. Okay. Question number one, for you panelists, what usually comes first? An idea that you have, and then, oh, I got a crying cat behind me. An idea that you have, and then you're sort of looking for a call for participation for a conference that fits with it, or there's a specific conference coming up and you think, oh, I should submit a proposal for that. How do you come up with your ideas? How do you find conferences that match the ideas, or do you always try to submit something to a big conference in your field? And I think you panelists, you can just unmute yourself and answer.
Hey, sorry, this is Amy. It's quiet in my house for a second, so I'm gonna take this.
Jump right in, Amy.
It's extra chaotic here right now. So for me, it's a little bit of both. You know, there's some conferences that I really like to go to or try to go to. And so, you know, if I see those, I will, you know, try to come up with an idea, but I also sometimes, you know, a project or an idea will present itself and honey, I'm talking, it's right under your pants. Sorry. And try to, you know, think, okay, this is the kind of thing that would be really good for like NCLA as an example. So when I did the alternative spring break, sorry, Jesus.
A busy morning at the house.
With Cassie, the LIS student, I knew immediately that that was the kind of project that would be really good for a conference. And so I, you know, just kind of waited for the right conference to come along. So I think it's a little bit of both, but I do recommend kind of keeping a list somewhere of potential ideas for projects, so that when a call comes up, you're kind of ready and you don't have to rack your brain quite so hard.
That is a good tip. I have never done that, but I like that idea. Any other panelists want to try this question?
Sure. It's happened both ways for me, and there's a kind of zen of preparation. I think you stay in a state of readiness as best you can, because, for example, one that dropped out of the sky was the national meeting of the Music Library Association in San Diego one year. It turned out the plenary session was sponsored by the Women in Music Roundtable, and the title of the session was going to be, We Wish They All Could Be California Girls, on Southern California women composers. And lo and behold, I had my eye on a particular one, and had always wanted to go out to Los Angeles, to Northridge, Cal State, to the archive there that's really the guitar equivalent of our cello music archive, where the foundational collection is by one Vada Olcott Bickford, who spent her over 100 years, I believe, nearly 100 anyway, mostly in Southern California, except when she was the guitar tutor to the Vanderbilts in New York and the Biltmore House.
Mhm.
Otherwise, she was a California girl. Any rate, that one, I had already started the research. It gave me an excuse to have a tax-deductible research trip out to
Very
the
nice.
collection. And then I thought my chances were really good on the proposal. And lo and behold, they jumped at Vada, Olcott, Bickford, and we were all really happy with the results. So that was the one that fell out of the sky. Yeah. There's it. Oh, thanks, Sarah. Another one that was just really vaguely in my mind, but I knew I wanted to do something. One of our cellists, Bernard Greenhouse, we had a celebration back in '06, I think, somewhere around then. And because he had donated his collection, he was 93, and we did not have any kind of oral history or really much in the way of primary documents at the time. And so I really wanted to work on that. And as it turned out, I went thinking to one of the early entrepreneurial conferences that UNCG did with Wake Forest back in maybe '08, something like that. And lo and behold, Doug Boyd shows up from the Louis B. Nunn Oral History Center at the University of Kentucky. And right before my eyes, he describes my project. Now, it meant I had to raise money. It meant I had to hire a videographer. It meant I had to get 4 days with the 93-year-old nearly blind Bernard Greenhouse, traveled to Wellfleet in July on Cape Cod. That was a real tour. And then create a presentation that eventually I didn't present it at a music conference. Through the videographer, we made a proposal to the Oral History Association conference. So that was never on my radar at the time. But we went and we're in the running for the sort of the project of the year with our oral history called Song of the Birds. It was a video oral history of Bernard Greenhouse teaching and playing at 93 from his home in Wellfleet on Cape Cod. None of that had I planned. It was really a speaker at the entrepreneurial conference that spurred the preparation.
So from Mac, I'm hearing two things. One, sometimes a theme or planned speaker at a conference sort of generates an idea for a proposal or helps you connect something that you have an idea for to a specific conference, or that sometimes the venue is one that you're not really aware of, but comes from other collaborators on a project, maybe their field or area of interest, or just something that they know about that they think would really fit in with a project.
And Maggie, I'd like to kind of piggyback on
Perfect.
Amy and Mac. I also, my efforts are kind of a mix of the conference and the research, but I also wanted to talk about strategizing and aligning your research with some of these conferences, and I'll give you an example.
Sure.
Keith and I were both doing a lot of research in the last couple of years on archiving World War I, both in North Carolina and then kind of a larger nation. And there were two conferences, one we went to in Canada and the other one we went to in Australia. Both required writing. The one in Canada, they were going to have a proceedings if you could get accepted. And in Australia, there was a potential of writing on your presentation and having it be included in an international journal. The good news about that is it's scary in a way because you've committed not only to presenting, but you've also committed to writing. But it's a good way to kind of hold yourself to that research and writing aspect of these conferences.
Yeah.
And it helps kind of strategize about writing if you kind of align it right. And I think that's helped me get out of a couple of great articles as well.
Well, that might be a good transition to the next question, since you're talking about the session format. And if David has a good answer to question one, we can come back. But also thinking about how do you choose the format to propose for your presentation, what goes into that decision. Some conferences maybe only really have a contributed paper or a panel, but ACRL, for example, has 9 different session formats. Oftentimes there are options for posters, lightning talks, interactive workshops. And if you do go with a contributed paper, then you have to write your paper first. Or if you're contributing to proceedings after the fact, sometimes you have an additional deadline afterwards, like Sam and I did for LOEX, even though we never saw what happened with that, even though we met the deadline. And so what is your advice for, yeah, that's right, Sam. It was a great paper. Who knows where it is? So what is your advice for choosing the format to propose for your presentation? What goes into that decision? What has your experience been with different types of formats in terms of proposals?
I'll jump in with this.
Perfect.
In a lot of cases, I am very, and part of this maybe speaks to the theme of some of the presentations I've been involved with, but I'm very much into presentations that involve more than one presenter, not necessarily a panel, but maybe 2 to 3 different people presenting together on a related topic. Now, this comes from the fact that a lot of the presentations I've done have been on the subject of interdepartmental or interinstitutional collaboration, so it kind of lends itself to that format.
That makes
but
sense.
it's really good having more than one person speaking. Number one, because, well, you share the work. But number 2, because you're not forcing your audience to sit there and listen to you drone on for an hour when, you know, they could listen to 3 people droning on for 15 or 20 minutes. I think conference panels like presentations like that too, because they feel like they're getting more buy-in and more participation.
Sure, more bang for your buck too as a audience member. You're hearing more ideas from more people in a single session.
Yeah, exactly. I think yeah, that's a good way to go. I honestly haven't done a lot with lightning rounds, that kind of thing. I've done several panels, but lightning rounds and et cetera, I haven't done. As far as formats, and this is not really a format question, but it's sort of related, I guess, is choosing the conference actually goes back to the first question.
Yeah, and please feel free.
I'm a big proponent of doing small regional conferences rather than big conferences. I get a lot more out of those from the attendance of the conference, but you know, it also goes into participating as well, because I think if you do the small regional, and with that I mean also small regional conferences that are outside your region, because if you do them locally, you're hearing a lot of people that you already talk to on a regular basis, and you know what they're doing. The first big solo presentation I did as a librarian was actually at the Midwest Content DM Users Group meeting. It was actually kind of a neat thing because there's a bunch of people I didn't know from Adam. But I heard a lot of interesting things that were going on that I didn't know about, and I think that's a good way to roll as well. So
yeah, that's interesting. I haven't looked into a lot of regional conferences in my sort of areas of interest, but I bet there are a ton out there.
Well, and state conferences from other states can be really good as well. Like, you know, I know a lot of people do VLA.
Yeah, I think Rachel and Megan were at VLA this year.
Yeah, I've been in a proposal there for the first time with Anna. Is she here? Also, I went to the Texas Library Association conference, which is like ALA. I mean, it's huge because Texas. But to get back, to the question that you actually asked, for me as a teacher, I like to do a workshop format. They are not less work, as Maggie and Jenny especially can attest, having done a pre-conference workshop, and Jenny and I did one at ACRL before last. But I really like the interactive format, and I like to, you know, force myself to spend time, you know, in discussion and in think, pair, shares, because then I get something out of it as well. And it's not just me talking at people, but it's really more of an exchange of ideas and information. So that I think it really goes for whatever your comfort level is. If you're one of those people that, really likes to write and maybe is a little nervous about public speaking, then contributed papers are a really good format. But, if you're a teacher and you want to do something more interactive, then, it just kind of, I think that it goes a lot to your comfort level, and also maybe the type of presentations you like to go to might also be the kind that you would want to pursue.
That's smart. Yeah, thinking about the sessions where you feel comfortable as an audience member can maybe give you some insight about what kind of session you would like to propose or lead. I like that.
Kathleen might want to jump in with an anecdote about this, and she's smiling, so maybe she knows what I'm talking about too. We did a session at the National Archives many years ago at this really odd conference, or it turned out to be a really odd metadata conference that actually was not really library people at all. It was engineers and imaging professionals and
from all over the world.
And it basically was assumed that it was going to be a presented papers conference. We didn't realize that at the time, and we didn't go into it prepared for that. I think everybody actually really liked our presentation because it stood out, because it wasn't just sitting there reading a paper like everybody else.
Yeah.
But
It was one of those conferences where it was just one group, like of three. I think that they capped it at like 300 people from all over the world, and like it was the same 300 people that was there several days. And we were sitting, and Anna and David and I were sitting there in the audience, and they were introducing all the people there, and they were all like had multiple doctorates, and we were just like, holy cow.
Yeah.
How are we here? But I mean, it was a great conference. We had a wonderful time, and we got a lot of mileage out of that. We ended up getting an article out of it.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to be said about being aware of the conventions of different like conferences or presentations for different fields, but then also not being afraid to bring yourself to the presentation when it's kind of outside of your normal kind of venue.
And the best part was we got to skip to the head of the line to see the Declaration of Independence too.
Very cool.
I know. On our break,
can I just jump in real quick here?
Yeah.
I try to just kind of pull out things from the chat for the recording.
Sure. Yeah.
Just wanted to point out that as our speakers have mentioned, local, well, sort of, I can't think of the word, close states to us, states in close proximity to us, struggling. It's kind of like regional, the state library associations from states that border us, that was the word, that we have had several thumbs up in the chat for the Georgia Libraries Conference and also for the VLA Conference. So I just wanted to point that out for the recording. I have never put anything in for either of those, but I have also heard wonderful things about them. So there we go.
And I've been to Merrick a couple of times. And David, was it Merrick, the one that we did the drive in the bus?
What's Merrick?
Mid-Atlantic.
Okay.
Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. That's a great conference.
I've done a couple of those, and they're really they're just a good group.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. TILC used to be more of a regional conference, the Innovative Library Classroom Conference, but I think it's sort of edging on national now in terms of where presenters come from. But that was originally, I mean, you do your registration through the Virginia Libraries Association. But yeah, I think has sort of extended out. So I think David talking about the sort of inter-institutional collaborations gets into my next question, which is, what is your process like for successfully working with others on proposals? Question that didn't make it on the slide. Have you ever solicited participants or collaborators on a panel going into a proposal? Like you have an idea for a proposal and you're looking for people who might fit on a session with you who you didn't know before the sort of call for participation went out? And then also, how do you handle the actual proposal writing process with other people? How do you handle different ideas or disagreements about the proposal? How do you write in the same tone of voice with other people? What's it like working with other people on proposals specifically? Anybody? If we don't like this question, we can move on.
What is it that Sartre says about other people? No, I'm just kidding. This is a great question, and if other people have ideas, I would love to hear them, because I don't think I figured it out. But at ACRL 2 years ago, I basically answered a listserv email from somebody looking to do a presentation about information literacy incentives. And I ended up working with somebody from Alaska, somebody from Denver, and somebody from Indiana. So, the first issue was actually finding times to meet, because Alaska Standard Time is very different than the East Coast. But I think what I've found and what worked best for us was to kind of have one person who's in charge, really dividing up the task, instead of trying to have a bunch of people write a proposal together. Like, one person do the learning outcomes, one person take the first draft at the short abstract, one person take the first swing at the long abstract, and then give people something to react to, because trying to write in a group is just nearly impossible.
That's good advice.
And I think that, writing the proposal, I think that's the best way to do it. And then I think that, to me, some of the issues arise in the actual crafting of the presentation. And I think that for that, the best idea is to just make sure that you're staying really true to your proposal, because we've all been to conferences where we read a proposal or read the abstract and been like, wow, this sounds really great. And then you get in the room and you're like, wow, that's not what they're talking about at all. So that can really help when you have a group, just kind of making sure that you're constantly referring back to, like, what did we say we were going to accomplish? And I think that can help make the actual creating the content of the presentation a lot easier, because I think it's easy to lose sight of that.
Amy, I want to just underscore what you said and the implications of what you said. I have never seen a group process work. I mean, somebody might have, but I've never seen one work if it was not run by some sort of moderator, whether that is the natural leader who emerges, but everybody needs to agree on that. But whether from middle school to the geriatric ward, there's always going to be somebody in the group who lets everybody else do the work. That has stuck around even in my professional experience, which was surprising the first time it happened. And a second point, not so much related to that, is that my real choice for collaboration is with a colleague whom I know well. That's not always possible, I understand. But now some of that is because I work a lot with Stacy, who is just a terrific collaborator, and we work on the same collection. So it's a special circumstance. But look for that in your colleagues, because a good partnership wears well, and there's nothing more valuable. It is so much more gratifying to me to do a collaborative, to share the pressures and every other aspect of it with another presenter than to go solo.
Yeah, I have only good things to say about working on proposals with my ROI colleagues, but it would be fun to look across departmental lines and see if there are any things.
Well, David and I have one actually. We famously did the Who's Driving the Bus tour, where I think that panel ended up to be David and me and Beth Ann and Jennifer Motzko. And where was that, David? Was it, I was thinking it was in Pittsburgh. And we kind of got to, I think sometimes it, a deadline's coming up for a conference and all of a sudden, yikes, it's upon you.
Yes. Yeah.
And a lot of times it's just that one person that might have that 30 minutes extra that day to kind of start to put something together and get the ball rolling. Often especially if you're within the library and you're doing it cross-departmentally with colleagues, sometimes just getting in the same room and brainstorming, you can almost write one up, especially if it depends on how involved the submissions are. And that's what things, we've kind of hinted on that. Some submissions are much more complicated than others.
Yeah.
And it can get pretty hairy, but some are not. Some just want your basic 250 word abstract. You can get those out pretty quickly. Sometimes the hardest thing, and we haven't talked about this, but I presume it's coming up, is to think of an interesting and engaging title.
Yeah, I do have a separate question for that. So,
and I would just like to say, Kathleen, remember that day that we sat in the room with Rachel and Armando and came up with that chance abstract for NCLA in like 45 minutes, and Paula, sorry, that was the greatest. Yeah, Rachel, she remembers, she was there.
Yeah.
It's like the greatest, like, I hate the word synergy, but like synergistic collaboration that's ever happened. We got that thing banged out in no time. It was fantastic. So yeah,
and sometimes that's really great, because if you can do that, if you can actually have a meeting like that, it works out, because otherwise, and sometimes you just don't have that time, but it all the brainstorming you'd be doing, kind of passing it off from one email to the other email, all happens in one room. And so I think when that happens, it's really great.
I would like to take a informal poll of the audience here. Who has submitted a proposal not on the last day it was due for a conference before? Have you ever submitted a proposal before? Sam?
I have.
I have.
Wow. Okay. So there are a lot of
people who are
not last minute people. Interesting. Okay. I am definitely one step. Yeah, I'm a down to the wire person. Yeah, it would be interesting to hear about that kind of workflow in maybe a workshop. We could have a workshop around this later. Okay, so moving on to question 4. So not all conferences require learning outcomes for sessions, but if you do propose to conferences that typically require learning outcomes, how do you approach writing them? Do you start with your learning outcomes, or do you write them at the end? ACRL in their webcast actually said to think about your desired learning outcomes and then choose your format based on that. But for me, that kind of seemed, I know that's backward design a little bit, but a little bit of cart before the horse, because I usually write my learning outcomes based on the session format after I've chosen it. So I guess learning outcomes can help you think of the format you want to go with. Like Amy said, Amy likes to teach, so workshop makes sense. But then if I am doing a panel, then my learning outcomes are going to be completely different than if I'm doing a workshop. So I usually wait until the end. Any thoughts on this part? And again, maybe not applicable to everyone on this panel. So feel free to share your observations in the chat as well.
I have trouble honing in on a topic, I think. So for me, writing learning outcomes helps me do that.
Okay, yeah.
And so, if I can say like, okay, it's backward design, right? What are the 3 things that I want people to walk out the room at the end of the session knowing? Then I can write those learning outcomes and then write the abstract that goes along with those. So that to me is a really helpful practice. And I mean, you may have to go back and tweak them after you've actually written the thing, but to have those 3 statements to start with and being able to write an abstract that will help you get there is how I personally work best.
Question about that. Do you think that it is essential that all of the outcomes can be assessed within the session itself? Or do you think, for example, a panel having an outcome like participants will be able to take away, tips about whatever is fine?
I think that's fine. And that it's a struggle for me as a teacher. I'm like, I need measurable outcomes.
Yeah.
But you do have to be a little bit more flexible. And I actually recommend to people to write learning outcomes anyway.
Yeah.
If you don't have to, just because it helps
That's a
you.
great tip. Yeah.
It helps you distill like down to the main points. What are the main things that I want people to take away from this? So even if they're not trying to tell people to do extra work, but I'm totally telling people to do a little bit of extra work.
I think that's a good approach. Yeah, and I think as long as your outcomes are theoretically measurable, whether or not you actually have the opportunity to measure them in the session, helps as well. Any other thoughts about learning outcomes? Again, I know that this may not be super applicable to the venues at which everyone presents.
I'm just curious to know, if conferences and other subfields of librarianship that aren't teaching
Instruction, yeah.
do require these. Okay, so Kathleen just said in the chat that most of the time archives conference submissions don't include learning outcomes.
Yeah, they're not listed in, I can't think of maybe one conference that was it, or one presentation at ALA many years ago needed such learning outcomes, but none of the, and most of my presentations are music specific. I still, even though I don't write the outcomes at the beginning, I do, for me, and I think this is a sort of a learning style thing, or my own style. I work on the presentation a lot, but I always want to get to those outcomes, even if only for me, because it helps me then go back and edit critically some of my own writing, because I will ramble and digress. And to help get that lined up, I do, and it's usually sort of at the end that the outcomes are clearest to me. So I use that sort of as an editorial tool, even though it's rarely required in where I present.
So hearing from both Amy and Mac that even if they aren't required, having writing them or having them in mind is a way to help you write your proposal to make sure that it captures your intentions for the session, and also as an editing tool at the end to make sure that the proposal is written to get all the major points that you wanted to get across, I guess. I'm bad at summarizing. I'm not a great moderator, but okay, so it's already 10:40. I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is that tips for coming up with engaging session names. One sub-question I have, because a lot of conferences have themes, how do you deal with session names when the conference has a theme that you feel doesn't really fit with your idea or proposal? But then also, what are your tips in general? Also, would love to hear some fun anecdotes about naming, brainstorming, all of that. Anyone?
Well, I have one. I've mentioned a couple of times the one I did with David and Jennifer and Beth Ann, who's driving the bus, and the presentation and subsequent article was about who actually drove the bus on digitizing archival material. Was it the archivists or digital projects group? And I think, now correct me if I'm wrong, David, I think for so long we just kept on saying, who's driving the bus? I mean, it kind of, and then it kind of became a working title. And then at some point we just said, that's going to be the name of it. And what was the whole name? It was like, it's the whole importance of the colon, you know? The
subtitle does a lot of work.
So it was who's driving the bus, colon, and what was the rest of it, David?
How digitization is affecting archival processing or something like that. And I just remember that we used the Partridge Family font and the Partridge Family motif.
It was really hilarious because David, as being the whiz kid that he is about cultural stuff, history, he arranged the whole presentation with Partridge Family theme, the colors of the bus, and I think he did all of the introductions of all of us in that Partridge Family thing with the little partridges. It was just precious. It was great. Everybody loved it.
I see.
That said, you can drive a metaphor into the ground to the point where it's a little cloying too.
And we did the whole trip.
Yeah, well, and I think that actually happens a lot with a conference theme, where you see some really tortured metaphors in conference themes or conference presentation titles, where someone's really trying to get their session name related to the theme. Rachel and Terry are having a conversation in the comments also about whether or not having a sort of cute or catchy name makes your proposal, stand out to the reviewers. In the ACRL webcast session that I watched, they sure do for LOX. At the ACRL webcast, they said it's a bonus, but they don't consider it essential. But it would be interesting to do sort of a quantitative review of ACRL sessions over the past years, whether or not the title of the presentation, overtly relates to the theme or not. Yeah, you can do that, Rachel. I think that would be a fun one. At the corner of Good, Bad, and Ugly. Yeah, the ACRL session or theme 2 years ago was a recasting, and there was a lot of fun metaphors that came up related to recasting the.
I'm terrified that we're going to start seeing flattening the curve metaphors.
Oh God, yeah, no, we will. Yeah.
But I think that I was talking about colons earlier. I don't think you should get too cute. That's irritating too, because I've been on the other side of the fence where you're trying to do the programming for conferences, and sometimes like, oh no, I don't even want to see that. But if you drive, for example, I'll say who's driving the bus. That was something that was a little colloquial, but then after the colon, we could get serious about what we were really talking about. So I think that there's a good balance.
Yeah, I agree with that format, where you got the cute part and then the real part. Because that's the thing, is that you want to make sure that people understand, you want to catch people's eye, but you also want people to know what you're presenting on based on your title. Because if you think about a big conference, people are not reading all the abstracts to decide which ones they want to see. They're looking at that title. And I do a presentation for NCLA about writing proposals, and I actually have a slide where I give people titles and I make them try to guess the theme of the conference. It's an ACRL.
I love that.
Which is, and they're so, the ones that I picked are very thinly connected to what the topic actually was. So it just was I'm glad that most conferences kind of have gone away from that a little bit, but man, ACRL is really clinging onto that for dear.
Yeah, in the comments or in the chat, Rachel mentioned LOX. LOX always has an overall theme and then themes for specific tracks, and so they really push having a cutesy thematic title for LOX, which is a library instruction conference, if everyone isn't familiar with it. Sam and I had one there that I thought was a pretty tortured metaphor that we went with throughout. I made Sam stick to in our presentation slides, involving a lot of clip art around swimming, but our icons were dope. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last question, and then we'll have hopefully about 10 minutes for audience Q&A and discussion. Kathleen briefly touched on being on the other side, putting together a conference program, but this question is about reviewing proposals. So has anyone on the panel served as a peer reviewer for conference proposals? And if so, how has that experience impacted how you write proposals?
I was actually just about to jump in on that on the last question when it comes to themes, because one thing, when I was on the entrepreneurial conference committee for a long time, and what really makes these committees nuts, or when you get all these proposals that look great, but they don't have anything to do with the theme whatsoever. And you get the feeling it's kind of like people who submit resumes to multiple jobs and don't tailor them in any way. You get the feeling that you're reading a presentation that's been submitted everywhere and they're not really even paying attention to what the proposal was. I think that does stand out. And I think a lot of conference committees probably would penalize you for being glaringly not related to the theme.
Yeah, I think if for some conferences it's a balance between, you know, addressing the theme, but sometimes your project doesn't have a whole lot to do with the theme, even though it has to do with the field, you know, or sort of topic of the conference. And so getting in there a little bit, but sometimes it's hard. I will say that also in the ACRL webcast, just to bring it back to that for a second, for ACRL specifically, they mentioned that reviewers for the second deadline, the posters, the lightning talks, all of that, get really annoyed when you don't do enough to repackage your presentation from the first format. Make sure that you read over it carefully so that you're not referring to a panel or a workshop when you're actually now submitting a proposal for a poster or a roundtable discussion. Make sure that you are thinking of the new format you're going for and rewriting your proposal, not just resubmitting it.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's important to really respect the theme, basically, which is what we've all talked about. And especially when you're on a programming committee, you usually you've been involved in selecting the theme.
Yeah.
So you're invested in that. And so when you see abstracts come along with the theme potentially included even somehow in the title and certainly in the abstract, it means a lot more, and it connects with you because again, you're right there involved in everything. And as far as repackaging and stuff with different type of formats, it's also been interesting on the other side to see that, you know, the programming committee really does want you to succeed. If, you know, they're trying to fit you in, and if you can be flexible in maybe even sometimes if you're presenting it as a singleton being put with somebody else or with another group, or if you could potentially bump up to a presentation if it's that good of a fit, or potentially bump over to a poster. Any kind of adaptations that you were able to make, to me, it makes it easier on the programming committee.
That makes sense. I will say also, having served as a reviewer for the ALA poster sessions, there will sometimes be proposals that are really, it's clear the project or the research is really excellent, but they haven't done anything to address the poster format and how that will, you know, they're writing a summary of their research and not a proposal for a poster. And so making sure that you address how you'll be presenting your research or your project or your idea in that format in the proposal, I feel like is really important, and not just talking about the project or the idea itself, because if you don't know how that's going to translate into the presentation as a reviewer, there's not really much you can do, regardless of how good the actual work is.
Also, something that y'all might want to do that I've done before is go back and look at previous conferences. A lot of times the programs are still up, and a lot of times different conferences, I don't know if y'all think this, kind of have the same, I don't know, pattern or something. You can kind of see the types of things that they like to accept. That sometimes is helpful too, especially if you kind of really are targeting one conference or you really want to get in that particular one.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna open this up for audience Q&A and also discussion. Obviously, we only had a handful of people here on the panels, and it sounds like from the chat there are people who also want to share their experiences, but also questions from the audience for the panel here. Open discussion, all of that. We have about 9 minutes left in our hour together, so I'm just gonna open up the floor here. Feel free to jump in the chat, but also you can unmute yourself as long as we're not talking over each other. So Rachel has a question about presenting posters and whether they count as an accomplishment at conferences like ACRL, national conferences. I certainly think they are, but I would love to hear from the panel. Are there, I guess, is the question, are there formats that aren't as prestigious at conferences?
Just like I'm just wondering if that's something, if that's good enough at like the tenure track level. You know, I don't know. I just have an imposter syndrome about that. I'm interested in what y'all think.
I love poster sessions personally as a presenter because you get to talk to so many people. It's almost like a networking opportunity, but I don't have enough experience as in the field to talk about the sort of big picture.
I think it's a great way to oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think the posters are a great way. Also, if you're kind of excited about an area of research you want to go into, you don't feel like you have quite fleshed out enough to do a whole presentation, but you want to kind of get it out there and get that interaction with people, posters are perfect for that.
I think particularly a big conference like ACRL, for example, doing a poster is almost more intimidating than doing an actual presentation because people are just coming up to you constantly and you have to think on your feet a lot more too.
Same with SAA, Society of American Archivists.
Yeah. Amy just pointed out the acceptance rate of posters at ACRL is still pretty low, and that they'll tell you the acceptance rate when you get accepted. And so that's something that you can refer to when you're trying to articulate impact of a presentation in, for example, an annual review or a tenure or promotion, review. I also think that some sessions are better. The ones that seem a little bit shorter or less formal are good for projects that you are working on at the time the proposal is due, and you're not sure necessarily what the outcome is. Sort of presenting ongoing research, preliminary results, things where you're not sure how it will work out one way or the other, because it can be hard to commit to a proposal, that's due almost a year before the conference and be able to say, this is what happened when it hasn't happened yet. Terry has a comment.
Hey, hopefully you can hear me just fine.
We can hear you great.
In some places, I presented at the Library Assessment Conference, and most of their presentations were 20-minute presentations for people.
Mm-hmm.
I did a poster session, and the poster session, people had to stand there at their posters for 4 hours as they had the
4 hours, wow.
And it was unbelievably grueling to do that poster session for that long, where their normal presentations were just, basically every presentation was a lightning presentation. Do the core information about what your research is about. 20 minutes, you're done. And then that was it. There was hardly any questions at all. So in some places, poster sessions require a lot more work.
That kind of sounds like the difference between online classes and in-person classes a little bit.
Right.
Where people, you end up having to do a lot more participation to demonstrate you're participating in an online class sometimes.
Right. And in order to distill your work down to be presented effectively in a poster often takes a good amount of creative work too.
Absolutely.
That people understand what your research is. And it's just, I've seen posters where people just slap up their papers essentially up, and it's impossible to read because you have to get 2 feet away from it in order to read it. But to distill your information into an effective poster is actually pretty creative.
These are all good points
Thanks.
about posters. Okay, does anyone have any other questions or comments as we wrap this up? It's 10:56. I don't want to pull anyone over time. I would also like to go to Australia for a conference. That sounds wonderful.
That was an International World War I conference.
Yeah.
So it was kind of unique, but yeah, that was an experience.
There is something to be said for choosing your presentation venue based on places you want to go.
I agree.
And don't necessarily want to pay to go.
Yeah.
Totally agree, 100%.
So Jenny is sharing the assessment form for the session in the chat. I'd like to thank our panelists, and if anyone wants to do the thing where we end the recording and you just say, hey, we can do that. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. Hopefully this, I learned some things that I think will be helpful for me in the future. Any last comments, anyone? Otherwise, I think we can end the recording. I don't have control of the recording. I think Jenny does.